Every great Black empire in recorded history, Egypt, Kush, Mali, Songhai, Axum, Carthage, collapsed the same way. Not the same enemy, not the same century, not even the same continent, the same internal sequence, step by step, as if someone had written the collapse in advance. And someone did. There is a text, written thousands of years before any of these empires fell, that describes exactly how a great civilization dismantles itself from the inside out. It names the stages. It names the consequences, and it names the people it was written for. Most of you have held that text in your hands your entire life. You were just never shown this part of it. By the time this video is over, you will understand why the same pattern has repeated across 6 major civilizations spanning 3,000 years, and why the people who controlled how that text was taught had every reason to make sure you never connected these dots. Stay with me. Here is exactly what we are going to establish. First, we are going to lay out the historical record of 6 Black empires and document the identical internal sequence that preceded each collapse. Specific dates, specific rulers, specific turning points most textbooks skip entirely. Second, we are going to open the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28 specifically, and show you that this sequence was not discovered by historians. It was written as a warning with a specific audience in mind. Third, we are going to go into ancient sources beyond the Bible, Josephus, the Book of Jasher, Herodotus, and Ethiopian royal chronicles, to show you that the people described in that warning match the archaeological profile of the African civilizations that rose and fell. And fourth, we are going to reveal the second pattern, the one inside the first pattern, the detail that changes everything you think the Bible is actually tracking. Here is your pattern tease before we go any further. Every one of these collapses began not with an invading army, but with a specific internal decision, a decision about identity. And that decision appears, word for word, in a text written before any of them made it. When you understand that, you will never read ancient African history the same way again. Let's go back to the beginning. Most people know that ancient Egypt was one of the longest-running civilizations in human history. Roughly 3,000 years of documented rule. What almost nobody knows is what Egypt was before the dynasties we are taught about in school. The earliest rulers of the Nile Valley, the pre-dynastic kings of the Nagata culture, dated by archaeologists to approximately 3,500 BCE, were a dark-skinned African population whose physical profile is documented in skeletal remains. Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop, whose 1974 work presented before the UNESCO Cairo Symposium used melanin dosage testing and comparative anatomy, made this case in front of the world's leading scholars. The response from mainstream academia? Silence. Not refutation, silence. Most people know Cleopatra. Almost nobody knows that she was the 7th ruler to carry that name, and that she came to power in 51 BCE during a period when Egypt had already been under Macedonian Greek rule for nearly 300 years. The Egypt that built the pyramids looked nothing like the Egypt that Rome eventually conquered. That distinction matters enormously, and we will come back to it. Now move south along the Nile. The kingdom of Kush, also called Nubia, outlasted Egypt as an independent African power. At its height between 760 and 650 BCE, Kushite pharaohs ruled Egypt. The 25th dynasty, the Black Pharaohs, controlled the most powerful civilization on earth for nearly a century. Taharqa, one of the most militarily accomplished rulers of the ancient world, is mentioned by name in both the Bible and in Assyrian military records. 2 Kings chapter 19, verse 9 says this, "And when he heard say of Tirhaka, king of Ethiopia, Behold, he has come out to fight against thee." That is a direct, contemporaneous mention in Scripture of a Black African king who posed such a military threat that the Assyrian army retreated during his reign. You were not told that part in Sunday school. But the 25th dynasty ended, and how it ended is where our pattern begins to take shape. Move west now, to the Sahel. The Mali Empire, founded in the 13th century by Sundiata Keita, controlled more gold than any nation on earth at its peak. In 1324, Mansa Musa made his famous pilgrimage to Mecca, a journey so extravagant, so historically documented, that historians estimate he single-handedly crashed the gold markets of Cairo, Medina, and Constantinople, by distributing gold so freely it caused decade-long inflation across North Africa and the Middle East. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, a European cartographic document, depicts him on the throne of Mali, holding a gold nugget. He was so well known that European mapmakers included him by name on their maps of the known world. And yet, within a century of Mansa Musa's death, the Mali Empire had fragmented beyond recovery. Then came its successor, the Songhai Empire, the largest empire in African history by landmass, controlling critical trans-Saharan trade routes. Centered at Timbuktu, where over 25,000 students attended what some scholars describe as the first organized university system in the world. Songhai collapsed in 1591, not to a Western European army, to a Moroccan force of just 4,000 soldiers armed with firearms. An empire of several million people, brought down by 4,000 men. The question historians ask is, how did Songhai fall? The question they almost never ask is what had already broken inside Songhai before those 4,000 soldiers arrived. Because when you study the internal records, the chronicles of Mahmud Kati, the Tarikh al-Sudan written by Asadi in 1655, a picture emerges that has nothing to do with military technology. It has everything to do with a sequence of internal decisions, a sequence that matches what we are about to find in the text. Deuteronomy 28 is one of the most significant chapters in the entire Bible. It is rarely taught in full. In most churches, verses 1 through 14, the blessings, get significant attention. Verses 15 through 68, the curses, are either glossed over, spiritualized out of context, or avoided entirely. And when you read them in full, especially with knowledge of African history, you begin to understand why. Deuteronomy 28 verse 15 says this, "But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee." Most readers have been taught this passage refers to a spiritual people, an invisible metaphorical nation. But the Hebrew word used here, goy, refers specifically to a nation, a people with land, a civilization with governance. What follows is not a spiritual metaphor. It is a geopolitical description. Deuteronomy 28 verse 25 continues, "The Lord shall cause thee to be smitten before thine enemies. Thou shalt go out one way against them, and flee 7 ways before them, and shalt be a moving spectacle unto all the kingdoms of the earth." Now consider Songhai, a civilization of millions, defeated by 4,000 men, documented in real time by Arab chroniclers who watched it happen and could not explain it militarily. That is not a coincidence, that is a pattern. This is pattern layer 1, the fracture from within. Before every major black empire collapsed externally, there was a documented moment of internal fracture, a split in leadership, a betrayal from within the ruling class. In Songhai, before the Moroccan invasion of 1591, there had been a civil war between 2 of Askia Dawood's sons that split the military command and left the empire without unified leadership for years. The Moroccan Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur monitored this fracture deliberately before sending his army. Now look at Deuteronomy 28, verse 44. "He shall lend to thee, and thou shalt not lend to him. He shall be the head, and thou shalt be the tail." The Hebrew word for head here is rosh, meaning the source, the origin, the one who sets terms. And tail, zanab, literally means the last, the subordinate, the one who follows. But in ancient Near Eastern political language, becoming the tail was a specific phrase used to describe a nation that had transferred its decision-making sovereignty to a foreign power. Not through conquest, through dependency, through economic arrangement. Songhai had become economically dependent on trans-Saharan trade controlled by North African intermediaries. Before the army came, the economic sovereignty was already gone. External collapse is always preceded by internal transfer of sovereignty, not military, economic, and then political. This is pattern layer 2, the abandonment of original knowledge. Timbuktu, at the height of the Songhai Empire, housed between 100,000 and 700,000 manuscripts, documents covering mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, and theology. Scholars from across the Islamic world came to study there. The city had an indigenous intellectual tradition that predated its conversion to Islam by centuries. When Songhai collapsed, an estimated 700,000 manuscripts were scattered, hidden, destroyed, or carried away. The knowledge infrastructure of an entire civilization, gone. Now read Hosea chapter 4, verse 6. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because thou hast rejected knowledge, I will also reject thee, that thou shalt be no priest to me. Seeing thou hast forgotten the law of thy God, I will also forget thy children. The Hebrew word translated destroyed here is dama, which more precisely means silenced, cut off, made mute. A people who once spoke, whose voice shaped civilization, are silenced. And the cause is not ignorance. The cause is rejection. The word is mayas, active refusal. These are not people who never had access to knowledge. These are people who had it and turned away from it. Now here is the moment nobody talks about. Before Songhai's collapse, the ruling class had begun to abandon the indigenous scholarly tradition in favor of external religious and political validation. The court increasingly sought legitimacy from Cairo and Mecca, not from their own ancient traditions. They were not conquered intellectually. They migrated away from their own intellectual foundation. That is pattern layer 2, and it appeared in Kush, in Egypt's late period, in Mali. In every case, without exception, this is pattern layer 3, the covenant broken at the point of prosperity. Here is the detail that controlled the timing of every collapse. None of these empires collapsed at their weakest point. They collapsed after or during their greatest prosperity. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage, the greatest display of wealth in medieval history, happened just decades before Mali's decline began. The 25th dynasty of Kush controlled Egypt at the height of regional power before the Assyrian invasions. Songhai's university system was at its peak in the decades before the Moroccan invasion. Deuteronomy 32, verse 15, says this, But Jeshurun waxed fat and kicked, thou art waxen fat, thou art grown thick, thou art covered with fatness. Then he forsook God which made him, and lightly esteemed the rock of his salvation. The name Jeshurun in Hebrew, is a poetic name used specifically for the people of the covenant. It comes from the root yashar, meaning upright, straight, the people who were called to walk upright. And what happened when they reached peak prosperity? They kicked. The Hebrew verb is bayit, to kick, to lash out, to reject authority. A livestock metaphor, an animal that has been fed until it is strong enough to resist the hand that fed it. This is not a metaphor about personal wealth. This is a description of national behavior at the moment of peak power, and it describes, with stunning precision, what the historical record shows happening inside every one of these civilizations at the moment before the fall. So why does this matter today? Because we are not studying ancient empires for academic interest. We are studying a pattern, and patterns do not stop repeating until they are recognized. Deuteronomy 28, verse 37 says, And thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all nations whither the Lord shall lead thee. The word byword in Hebrew is shenina. It means a taunt, a cautionary tale told by others about you. This describes a people whose history has been so thoroughly processed by outside voices that their own story is used as an example, not of greatness, but of failure, whose civilizations are studied in Western universities as evidence of collapse rather than as evidence of what was once possible. Now we go further than most researchers take this. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian whose Antiquities of the Jews remains one of the most cited ancient sources in biblical scholarship, makes a specific observation in Book 1, Chapter 6 that almost nobody discusses in the context of African history. He records the descendants of Ham, the son of Noah, as the progenitors of the peoples of Africa, and he specifically traces the Cushites, the Egyptians, and the Canaanites to this lineage. The name Ham in Hebrew is cham, and its root meaning is hot, warm, or burnt. This is not a derogatory description in the original text. It is a geographic and climatic identifier. The people of the warm regions, the Africans. Josephus records that the descendants of Kush settled from the river Siris to Egypt, a continuous African settlement record that matches the archaeological distribution of pre-dynastic African civilizations from Ethiopia through Egypt to the Nile Delta. The Kebra Nagast, the Ethiopian royal chronicle compiled in the 14th century CE, but drawing on oral traditions going back to at least 1000 BCE, understands the Ethiopian royal house as a covenant people operating under specific divine terms. And the Axumite Empire, which this dynasty ruled, followed a trajectory almost identical to what we have already described: rise under covenant consciousness, peak prosperity, internal fracture, external collapse. The same pattern, a different continent, a different century. Now here is the thread most videos on this topic miss entirely. The collapse pattern we have been tracing is visible on the surface: internal fracture, economic dependency, abandonment of indigenous knowledge, prosperity followed by covenant rejection, external destruction. But there is a second pattern running underneath all of it, and it shows up in a verse almost nobody cross-references with African history. Leviticus 26 verse 17. And I will set my face against you, and ye shall be slain before your enemies. They that hate you shall reign over you, and ye shall flee when none pursueth you. They that hate you shall reign over you. In Hebrew, sane, those who despise you. Not necessarily military conquerors, administrators, cultural managers. The second pattern is this: in every major Black empire, there is a documented moment where outside advisors, cultural brokers, religious intermediaries, trade negotiators, gained access to the internal governance structure, not as conquerors, as advisors, as welcomed guests. In Egypt's third intermediate period, roughly 1070 to 664 BCE, foreign-born administrators had accumulated enough influence over Lower Egypt that when Kush's 25th dynasty attempted to reunify the country under indigenous rule, they were fighting not just military forces, but an entrenched administrative class that had rewritten the terms of Egyptian identity. In Mali, the same pattern. Foreign Islamic merchants who had been welcomed as trade partners gradually became involved in the certification of political legitimacy. Kings sought their approval. The indigenous identity framework began to require external validation to be considered legitimate. Every empire collapsed first at the level of self-definition. Who defines what it means to be us? When that answer moved from internal to external, the empire was already lost. The army was just the announcement. Isaiah 5 verse 13 says, Therefore my people are gone into captivity, because they have no knowledge, and their honorable men are famished, and their multitude dried up with thirst. No knowledge. Not no intelligence, no knowledge. The Hebrew is da'at, intimate, experiential, covenantal knowledge. The knowledge that comes from being in relationship with who you actually are. When that is severed, when a people no longer know themselves in the covenantal sense, captivity is not an invasion. It is a natural consequence. Now here is the modern parallel that makes this urgent for right now. We are living through a documented crisis of institutional knowledge in Black communities. Historically, Black colleges and universities, the most direct institutional successors to the Timbuktu model of self-generated knowledge infrastructure, are facing unprecedented funding crises, enrollment pressures, and accreditation challenges. Many HBCUs operate with endowments that are a fraction of comparable institutions. In some cases, less than 1% of the endowment of peer schools. This is not an accident, and it is not new. It is the same sequence we have been tracking across 3,000 years of history. The question the pattern asks is not who is doing this to us. The question the pattern asks is, at what point did we stop defining for ourselves what knowledge is and who controls it? And that question brings us directly to the biggest reveal in this video. Deuteronomy 28, verse 68. Read this carefully. And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships. By the way whereof I spake unto thee, thou shalt see it no more again. And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. The Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again, with ships. Egypt, Mitzrayim in Hebrew, the place of double constriction, the house of bondage, the place they had already left once, with ships. The original Exodus, the departure from Egyptian bondage, was on foot, through the wilderness, through the Red Sea, not on ships. Ships are not mentioned in the original Exodus narrative. So what is Deuteronomy 28 verse 68 describing? It is describing a second captivity, A captivity so complete, so disorienting, so unprecedented in its mechanism that it required ships to execute. And it is described as a return to Egypt, not the geographic location, but the condition. Bondage, constriction, double limitation, the transatlantic slave trade, which operated from roughly 1500 to 1900 CE, transported an estimated 12.5 million Africans across the Atlantic on ships. This is not contested history. It is documented in the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database maintained by Emory University, one of the most rigorous historical data sets in existence. 12.5 million people brought into bondage on ships, and the people taken were predominantly from the regions of West and Central Africa, the same geographic corridor that had been home to the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire, the Kingdom of Kush's extended cultural influence, and dozens of smaller kingdoms whose political and religious structures bore the markers of the covenantal pattern we have been tracing. When you understand that, you realize that Deuteronomy 28 was never just a theological text for a Sunday sermon. It was a geopolitical timeline, written in advance for a specific people, tracking a specific arc. Now close every open loop. We open this video asking why every major Black empire collapsed the same way. We promised you a pattern. Here it is, stated completely. The empires that collapsed were not random civilizations. They were civilizations operating, however imperfectly, however intermittently, within a covenantal framework, a framework that carried specific terms, specific conditions for flourishing, and specific consequences for departure from those conditions. When they kept covenant, they built pyramids that still stand. They produced mathematical and astronomical knowledge that Europe would not rediscover for 1,000 years. They ran university systems when the concept of the university did not yet exist in the Western world. When they broke covenant, not all at once, but gradually, through the sequence we have traced, the protection lifted, not as supernatural punishment, as natural consequence. The same way a building loses structural integrity not when the last support is removed, but when the pattern of load-bearing is disrupted over time. Deuteronomy 7 verse 6, "For thou art an holy people unto the Lord thy God. The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself, above all people that are upon the face of the earth." The word segolah, translated special, means treasured possession, personal property of the highest value, not generic religious language, a specific, legal, covenantal term. Amos 3, verse 2. "You only have I known of all the families of the earth. Therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities." The word known here, yada, is the deepest Hebrew word for relationship, covenantal intimacy. And the consequence of that depth of knowing is not immunity from consequence. It is accountability beyond what other nations face, because the covenant terms were higher. Lamentations 1 verse 1. "How doth the city sit solitary that was full of people? How is she become as a widow? She that was great among the nations and princess among the provinces. How is she become tributary? A city once full, now empty. A nation once setting the terms, now paying tribute to others." This is not a lamentation about one moment in one city. This is the recurring chord of a civilization that keeps forgetting and being reminded who it is and what it was given. Let me give you the pattern. Clean. 3 movements, every time. First movement, a covenant people builds extraordinary civilization. The evidence is architectural, astronomical, literary, and political. The power is undeniable and documented by their enemies, which is the most credible kind of corroboration. Second movement, at peak prosperity, a sequence begins. Identity starts to be defined externally. Indigenous knowledge systems are gradually abandoned or subordinated to outside frameworks. Economic sovereignty transfers quietly. Leadership fractures internally, usually over access to outside validation and resources. This sequence is not rapid. It takes generations, but it is consistent. Third movement, the external collapse comes, and it comes with a specific quality, disproportionate. A force that should not have been able to defeat what they faced, defeats it, because the inner architecture was already compromised. The outer wall was the last thing to fall, not the first. 3 movements, 6 civilizations, 3,000 years, the same score. Now here is what this means for you. Not for a civilization in a textbook, for you, sitting where you are right now, carrying the weight of a history you were mostly taught to be ashamed of, or told was irrelevant, or handed back to you filtered through an institution that had its own reasons for the framing. The pattern we have traced did not end with the transatlantic slave trade. The same sequence, external definition of identity, erosion of indigenous knowledge infrastructure, economic dependency, internal fracture, is documentable in the post-emancipation period forward to this day, which means one of two things is true. Either this is coincidence, the same pattern appearing across 12 civilizations spanning 30 centuries is just remarkable bad luck, or the text is right, and there is a covenant still in effect. And the question is not whether the pattern will continue. The question is whether this generation will be the one that finally recognizes it clearly enough to interrupt it. Here are the two questions I want you to sit with. If the collapse pattern always began with an internal decision about identity, about who gets to define who we are, then what does it mean that the most intense battles in our communities today are about exactly that question? And if the text described this arc before it happened, not once but repeatedly, across civilizations that did not know each other, what else in that text are we not reading carefully enough? I want those answers in the comments below. What we covered tonight is the first pattern, the collapse sequence. But there is a second video that needs to be made, and it is the one that changes everything. Because Deuteronomy 28 does not end at verse 68. The prophetic record does not end with captivity. And if the collapse pattern is this precisely documented, this specific in its details, then the restoration pattern should be equally specific, equally verifiable, equally traceable in the historical record. And it is. The next video in this series will examine something almost no one has done, a pattern-based reading of the return prophecies. What the conditions are, what the timeline looks like, and which civilization, right now in 2026, is showing the early markers of what those texts describe as the beginning of the reversal. This series is not about where we have been. It is about recognizing where we are in the pattern, so that for the first time in a very long time, we are not caught by surprise by what comes next. Write this down. A people who understand the pattern are the only people the pattern cannot repeat on. If this video gave you something you did not have before, share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. And drop your thoughts in the comments, because the most important conversations about this material happen after the video ends, not during it. The pattern is not finished. Neither are we.